Hi, I'm going to be giving you an introduction to digital photography today using a DSLR. So we're going to be doing, hi, I'm going to be giving you an introduction to DSLR photography today. So I'm going to show you just an abbreviated version of the presentation that I usually give in my full-length classes. So we're going to start with a few simple techniques, talk about how exposure works, and then talk about your three main tools for doing photography. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to share a screen with you so you can see some important things that we're going to go over. So there we go. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is creating images. So this is the most important thing I want you to learn about, and that's the exposure triangle. So the exposure triangle, the way photography works is you have three main tools. That's shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So those are the three ways you're able to control how much light is entering into your camera. So you're going to be using your light meter to measure the light in the scene, and then you'll use your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO to control how much light is going to be entering into the sensor in your camera. So let's go ahead and talk about these one at a time. Okay, so the first one is aperture. So you'll notice that on my sample here, I have f1.8 all the way up to f16. Depends on your lens, what range is there. So it might be wider than 1.8, it might start at 3.5, and it may go up to f22 or even higher. So what I want you to notice is that the opening in the lenses is very different. So at f1.8, there's quite a large opening that's going to let in a lot of light. And at f16, it's a very small opening that's not going to let in very much light. So when you have a dark scenario, those more open apertures are going to be really helpful in getting a correct exposure. And when you have a very bright, sunny scenario, the smaller apertures will work. Now, something else that it's important to know is that aperture controls depth of field. So if you look at the sample photos in the slide, you'll see that at f16, there's sharpness all the way from the foreground to the very back. And at f1.8, there's just a very small slice of focus in the image. So that is how aperture controls how much light goes into your camera, and it's also how it affects how your image looks. Now, aperture is located inside of your lens, whereas the other two tools are located inside of your camera body. Okay, so your next tool is shutter speed. So shutter speed is referring to how fast the shutter opens and closes inside of your camera. So this one is not in the lens, it's in your camera body. So when you want to freeze action, it's very important that you have an extremely fast shutter speed. And by extremely fast, I'm talking about probably 1/500th or even faster. You can get away with 1/250th if you have not very much available light. But you may get very slight blurriness in a running child or some action that's very, very fast moving. Now there are some fun projects you can do with a slow shutter speed using a tripod, but in general, when you're hand holding your camera, you want to be at 125 or faster. So that's 1/125th of a second or faster. And something that I see a lot is that people who are shooting in auto, they end up with a photo that has a lot of motion blur. Now that is because you probably don't have enough light to support the other settings. Sometimes in auto, your camera will choose 1/30th of a second or even slower. And that's just not fast enough to account for the motion of pushing the button on your camera. So I recommend about a minimum of 125. Some people are comfortable a little bit lower than that. So just really experiment around that range and see what works for you. So the last tool you have to control how much light is coming into your camera is ISO. So ISO is kind of what used to be film speed. So and in my own personal photography, it's the setting that has the widest range that I use. So with aperture and shutter speed, I'm usually using a pretty small range of settings. And then with ISO, I'll go all the way from 100 up to 6400. And sometimes I've gone even higher than that. But ISO is really going to, for me, it's the greatest variability, and I use that to account for how much light there is in the setting, and then I use aperture and shutter speed based on how I want my image to look. Now the drawback, you want to be as low as you can in ISO at all times, and that's because you'll have a higher quality image with more clarity. and less noise. So when you use a high ISO, you're going to get what's called noise. It's a grainy quality and sort of an overall lack of clarity in your image. So if you have to use a high ISO because that's what's required by your lighting, that's fine. But just when you can, when you have a lot of existing light, you want to use a lower ISO when possible. Okay, so let's go back to that exposure triangle, and you have 3 different tools to control how much light is in your camera. So how do you know how much light there is? First, you're gonna kind of take a step back, look around, and sort of use your best guess. And you could use also a cheat sheet. So there's photography cheat sheets that will tell you things like 100 and 200 are good for very, very bright light, like a sunny day at the beach. And then sort of mid-range ISOs like 400 to 800 are good for, moderate lighting like a cloudy day or indoors with bright window light. And then higher ISOs like 1600 or above, or 1000 or above. Those are best for darker scenarios like very minimal window light or nighttime and things like that. But these all work together. So if you change aperture to be more open, you may have to increase your shutter speed to compensate for that light coming in. So remember, aperture is an opening in your lens that allows light in. So the bigger the opening, the more light is going to be able to come in. That's best for darker scenarios. Shutter speed is a shutter that actually opens and closes. So it's almost always going to be a fraction of a second, but when it's open longer, it's going to let in more light than when it's open for a shorter period of time. And then the last tool that you have is ISO. And then ISO is basically the same as film speed. It's essentially the sensitivity of the sensor inside of your camera. What my experience has been is that a higher end camera, like a full frame professional camera, is going to do a better job at handling high ISOs than an entry level camera. But nowadays they all do a pretty good job. Okay, so at the bottom here, I wrote noise is more desirable than motion blur or out of focus images. So that's kind of my advice to increase your ISO as high as it needs to be to get that photo. So as long as you are as low as you can be on shutter speed, which might be 1/500th of a second, 1/250th of a second, just depends on what you're photographing. And you're at the widest aperture you can be while still keeping your subject in focus, so you have enough depth of field. Once you get to those 2 places, feel free to raise your ISO as high as it needs to be to get that photo, because the alternative is that you have either motion blur from having too slow of a shutter speed, which is unacceptable, or an out of focus image from having your depth of field too small. So I also feel that that's unacceptable. So that's my advice, is to raise your ISO as high as it needs to be, as long as you have maxed out the other 2 settings. Okay, so let's talk about camera modes. So a lot of these entry-level cameras have a lot of different auto modes. So they're all fully automatic. The only difference is that you're giving your camera a little bit more information about what you're photographing. So for instance, if you are photographing a moving subject, your camera is going to prefer a faster shutter speed if you put it on the little running guy here. And then for portrait, if you select the lady with the hair, it's going to open the lens a little bit more to give you that blurry background. Now, are these going to work perfectly? No, absolutely not. Auto mode is a good fallback mode. If you either are trying to capture a moment and you cannot get it right in manual and you don't want to miss that moment, go ahead and try one of these auto modes, and just for sort of like a safety. But in general, I find that people have a real lack of control in auto, and they just are not getting the results that they want. So that brings me to semi-auto. So there are 2 semi-auto modes that we're going to talk about today. One is aperture priority, and the other is shutter priority. So when you're using these modes, you want to make sure that you have your ISO set to the number that you want. Don't put the ISO on auto, because if you are using aperture priority and your ISO is in auto, it's really pretty much the exact same as shooting in full auto. So I want you to be setting your aperture and setting your ISO, and allow your camera to pick the right shutter speed for you. So when you look through your viewfinder, you're going to start to get used to seeing all the numbers at the bottom, and keep an eye on the shutter speed. Make sure that it doesn't, even if you're in aperture priority, You want to make sure that your shutter speed doesn't go below a number that you're comfortable with. So if it starts to go to like 1/30th of a second, you know that you have to raise your ISO to a place where it's going to allow for you to use the aperture that you want. Now, shutter priority is a really good one if you know you need to freeze action, or you're working with pets or toddlers, that kind of thing. You could put your shutter on, say, 1/500th of a second, put your ISO on a setting that's appropriate for the amount of light you have. So if you are outside on a sunny day, you would have your ISO on 100. If you are outside on a cloudy day or late in the day or in the shade, you might put it on somewhere around 400 or 800. But you could put it on 1/500th of a second, set your ISO where it needs to be, and then let your camera choose the aperture. So the drawback is that you're not choosing the aperture, of course. So you don't really have control over depth of field. But shutter priority can work really well in any auto or semi-auto setting is going to work much better in extremely bright light. So like, outdoors, basically any time of day outdoors. Then it's going to work in darker lighting. So like window light in your house, it makes it really hard to get an accurate exposure in those. So that is why I recommend that you start shooting in manual. So in manual mode, you have complete control over all aspects of creating the image, but it does take time to learn. So you have to do a lot of practice, and you have to do a lot of review of your photos. Now, manual mode is essentially required for proper lighting in scenarios like backlighting or indoors using window light, things like that, where your camera might expose for the background, but you want to expose for someone's face, things like that. Sometimes you just need that control. And I'm going to go back and say not sometimes, always you need that control. But as you're learning, I have no problem with falling back on these other modes. But I would say the goal is to shoot in manual when you have the time. Now, how do you know what settings to use in manual? Well, there's a light meter inside of your camera. So when you look through your viewfinder, you're generally going to see something that looks like these little pictures I have on the screen, where it'll say +1, +2, or even +3, and then minus on the other side. So if your meter is right in the middle, what your camera is telling you is that based on what it is seeing coming through the lens, your settings that you have your camera on are going to create a correctly exposed image. Give me 1 second. Now, if it's to the left or to the right, what that's telling you is that your image is going to be over or underexposed. So that in that scenario, you would want to change your settings until the meter gets to the middle. Or if you want it to be lighter or darker than what your camera is recommending, that's fine. It's really up to you as the photographer to decide where your meter should be. Okay, so here's a little practice. So I actually recommend that you do ISO first. So 100 to 2000 is probably a good range for a starter camera. But again, feel free to experiment with really high ISOs if you want to, and just see how they look in Lightroom. White balance, I recommend you just leave it on auto. Generally will do a pretty good job, and then you can use Lightroom or whatever your editing program is to adjust it as needed. Okay, so that's my intro on DSLR photography. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you soon.